Hello, everybody. Dr. Ben Edwards here. Welcome to another episode of You're the Cure. I've got an amazing guest today, Dr. Pierre Kory. I first met Dr. Kory, didn't meet him, but heard about him and started following him during COVID. A few of us doctors, for some reason, I call us the common sense clinicians with compassion. But we got to communicating through various means during COVID to try to help patients, and the frontline critical care doctors, and Dr. Pierre Kory was in that group. And then, of course, more recently with the measles outbreak. But Dr. Kory's got a unique perspective, and I wanted him to share his life's journey really in medicine and just really the microscope on American medicine that I talk about it all the time. We spend the most money to get the worst health outcomes, and we got to do something different. And the something different is happening. There's physicians coming out of the system. There's patients coming out of the system. There's different ways to even do health insurance now. So it's happening. Whether it's going to happen inside the system with government, insurance, Medicare, all that changing also, time will tell. But that'll be the conversation today. Where are we at with American medicine, and what's the future look like? So Dr. Pierre Kory, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Ben, my pleasure. It's good to see you again. Good to work with you.
Well, yeah. I want you to start. I want to go back before, I call it the awakening. So many people are waking up, but just going back, college, med school, whatever, even before that, if you want to, when did you think about becoming a doctor? How'd those first years go? And then what's changed, and why did things change recently?
All right. You know what? I'm in the mood, Ben. I'm going to say things about myself I haven't said before.
All right. Let's hear it.
Inspire me. So I'll bring you back to my lowest point in my life. So I was a bit of a messed up teenager. Just always want to go out with friends. I was actually a good student. I didn't find school that challenging. I went to a public school and I thought it was a bit of a joke. I barely studied and I did well, but I was like really misbehaving, partied a lot too much in college. And oddly, I kind of almost flunked out of college. I graduated with a 2.67 GPA. And only you know how tough that is to become a doctor. But here's the weird thing is that I always kind of wanted to be a doctor. Like when I was in college, like business did not interest me at all. Like I was kind of anti-business. Law, not really. I couldn't really write that well at the time. And I just couldn't figure out, but I like science and math. I was actually a math major in college. And so I kind of thought I was going to be a doctor or a teacher. And, fast forward 10, 15 years, I became both. I was, an educator. I ran a training program in pulmonary and critical care. I was a really well-invited lecturer. I gave a lot of courses and stuff. But to get from a 2.67 to becoming a doctor, that was quite a journey. So what I like to remind people is I literally was in the restaurant business all in my 20s. I didn't go to medical school until I was 29 because I was trying to kind of rehabilitate myself in terms of went to graduate school to get better grades. And even with really good grades and getting invited to work on research by professors in graduate school, Ben, I couldn't get into an American medical school. They just would not. They liked my MCATs. They didn't like my GPA. And they just wouldn't take me. And so I went overseas. I went to Grenada and had the great time there. I think I got an excellent training. I did my residency stuff in New York City and my fellowship there. And once I graduated and got good residencies and training, my career kind of took off. I mean, I got really, as you know, I'm a pulmonary and critical care physician. And I was one of the youngest program directors in the country. I took over the program at 4 years out. And so I was running a training program, and I lucked up, and I trained under some phenomenal doctors. My first mentor was a guy named Paul Mayo, who is literally probably the world expert at critical care ultrasonography. He essentially pioneered the field, at least in this country. And I was his lieutenant, his right-hand man. And I became a world-renowned ultrasound expert. And so I taught courses all over the country, put together the courses for the American College of Chest Physicians. I mean, I did that for years. I was constantly, every few months, traveling to some city or another. We would hold these big courses. And so many doctors were coming to those courses because they were seeing just how impactful it was when you had a crashing patient to put a probe on their chest, see what their heart was doing, see if their lungs were full of water, look for a DVT. I mean, there's so many applications that we were using it for. And it gave you these kind of, I'm almost going to say like superpowers. Like I felt like I knew more stuff about my patient with that ultrasound probe in my hand than I ever could have otherwise. And, when I would go to like emergencies or other things where I'd see doctors who didn't know ultrasound, they're just like screaming for tests. Check this, check a blood gas, check, this, get an x-ray. And like, I could find out so many things really quickly at the bedside. And when you have someone crashing, it's really important. So I fell in love with critical care ultrasonography, and I wrote I ended up being the senior editor of a textbook that's translated into like 7 languages. It's in its 3rd edition now. And so that was like my first kind of subspecialty area of expertise. I also had a transformative case of using therapeutic hypothermia in cardiac arrest, and that became another thing of mine. So like I became nationally known for being an expert at therapeutic hypothermia. I wrote papers, did research. So I got really interested in treating cardiac arrest. And then this is where the story gets real interesting, Ben. I met a guy named Paul Marek. So
Yep.
Paul came into my life, which is kind of a funny story. It was after I call it a landmark paper showing this immense mortality reduction in severe sepsis with the use of IV vitamin C. It was paired with thiamine and corticosteroids, but the IV vitamin C carried most of the water. And the funny little background is, I think you'll appreciate this as a doctor, because you also asked me about like, what was it like before you were awake and now? So you have to understand something about Paul Marek and my specialty. He was really well known. Like when I was a fellow, you'd hear people talking about Marek. And the reason why Marek was so talked about is he would always be invited to our annual conferences for the 2 major societies in our specialty. His lectures were always like standing room only, because he was consistently contrarian to the consensus. Like, people would, for septic shock, people were bolusing 3 liters of saline. He would put together all of the evidence why physiologically and clinically that is a bad thing to do, is to flood these patients with all these saline, and which went against all the guidelines and standards of care. And so he would really make you think about what we were doing. Like, why are we doing this if the science says what Paul is saying? And he did that with a number of things. So he's this well-known guy. In fact, he is, or was, when his career ended, he was the most published practicing intensivist in the history of our specialty. Wow. And this weird caveat happened is that I wrote what's called a pro-con editorial. So I did the con for the major journal in our specialty. I was invited to write this opposing viewpoint article, and I did it on a topic that was heavily influenced by Paul's work. And after that got published, I got an email from the great Paul Marek, and I was like totally honored, like starstruck a little bit that Paul Marek is writing to me. And you think about it, it was a really cute email, because it was so funny. He writes to me basically telling me that I did a really good job with my article, but I missed this paper. And he sends me the paper that I didn't cite.
Classic. That's what a great professor.
It was so cool though. And actually what happened was that paper got published after I'd already finished my draft. So it wasn't like I totally missed it, but it was a good paper. Anyway, the weird thing is, Ben, is I got that email from him and I never replied. And I don't want to go into too much of why, but it was because I was going through a really overwhelming personal family crisis at the time. I had 3 children, 2 of whom had catastrophic cases of what's called pandas. I'm sure you know what pandas is.
Yeah.
And it was at a time where the system was failing us. Everyone was telling me that my daughter was anxious, and she suddenly developed a general anxiety disorder, which was complete nonsense. But we were flailing. I mean, we were going to all these doctors, and they were just it was a really difficult time in my life. And I remember getting the email and not replying to him, but I always left it bolded in my inbox. Like whenever I'd clear out my inbox, I always left that email from Paul Marek. Fast forward like 3 years, and Paul publishes his paper on IV vitamin C. And this is where it's kind of funny. I see the paper. I have a lot of respect for Marek, but I'm like, what is this BS? He's reducing mortality from 40% to 8% with a vitamin. I mean, you got to understand the old me, right? Vitamins. Who takes vitamins? That's all nonsense. That's all silly. Yeah, vitamins cures everything, right? And so like you're kind of trained if you're in the system to be anti-vitamin, right? It's all quackery. It's all nonsense. It's all these health claims. And so I would always ignore vitamins. But that paper kind of stuck in my head, but I dismissed it. And I will tell you, all of my colleagues did too, except they did it for different reasons, because his was a retrospective observational trial. They would say, they were saying that you can't rely on that trial. When the mortality drops from 40% to 8%, it has nothing to do with the design of the trial. You have to explain why it's so impactful. And I just remember just kind of dismissing it without examining it. But the problem was a year later, I was in the ICU. It was a bad ICU week in terms of mortality rates. They fluctuate throughout the year. And like this week, Ben, I had a lot of dying patients. And I remember there was this Chinese patient, and the family was in so much distress because he was dying. And they were begging me to do something, anything, try anything you can. And I was like, oh, there's that stupid Merrick protocol with the vitamins. So I pull the paper and I order the 3 elements. It's high dose IV vitamin C, IV thiamine, and IV corticosteroids. I kind of already had corticosteroids in my protocols, but I tried it on him and he died a few hours later. But I did not think anything of it, because anyone who's literally actively dying, there's not much you can do for them. But since I'd used it once, a couple of days later, I had a severe sepsis patient with necrotizing fasciitis. I put her on the protocol, and I saw her kind of stabilizing before she went to the OR, but then she went on the surgical service. But now I'm sort of like, it's like a tool in my pocket. I don't know that it works. I know it's harmless, and it's something I can pull out in sick patients. But here was like the big thing is that I had a patient admitted to my ICU one morning from the bone marrow transplant floor. So they were 6 days out from their bone marrow transplant, which means they have 0 white cells, right? Bone marrow hasn't taken yet. And they were completely overwhelmingly septic. So disoriented, tachycardic, breathing fast, on 2 pressors with no blood pressure and no urine in the bag. The wife is freaking out. She's never seen her husband this sick. And I knew he was going to be on a vent like within hours. I mean, he just looked terrible. Start the Merrick protocol. And I don't know what happened that day, if I saw him before I left or I'd heard reports he was getting better, but come in the next morning. Ben, this is a guy got admitted 11 a.m. I think it was like a Wednesday. I come in the next morning. He's the first patient I go see in the ICU. Walk into his room. He's sitting in an armchair eating scrambled eggs, and there's a full bag of urine, attached to his catheter. And he's off of all pressors. And the nurses say to me, oh, yeah, he's being transferred back to the bone marrow transplant floor. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like severe septic shock with no white cells. And on rounds, so we still rounded on him. On rounds, the cultures come back 4 out of 4 E. coli in the blood. 4 out of 4 bottles. Okay. And I'm sitting there and I'm trying to tell the team like what just happened. I was like, and I was telling my fellow, I was like, I in my career have never seen severe septic shock and multi-organ failure turn around in less than 24 hours. Like this guy was going back to the room. During rounds, the bone marrow transplant attending had come down to see him, and he interrupts my rounds and he goes, Pierre, what did you do to him? I thought for sure he'd be on a circuit and event by now, meaning a dialysis circuit and an event. And I look at him. I'm like, Mark, you're not going to believe this. I gave the guy IV vitamin C. And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders. He's like, okay, whatever, But anyway, that's a long segue to say that after that experience, I started integrating in my practice, and I saw other quote unquote just dramatic recoveries, but not always. And I didn't know, and I started to do research into it. And when I got interested, I ended up writing back to Paul Merrick. So a few years later, I wrote back to him and I was just like, this IV vitamin C thing is huge. We got on the phone. Our first conversation, we spent 2 hours talking about IV vitamin C. Paul was telling me what he was seeing in his unit. He said, barely anyone goes on dialysis anymore. He says he thinks the nephrologists are getting pissed because they make a lot of money from dialysis in the hospital. But he said that he was down to like 1.1 day admissions for septic shock, literally just turning people around with septic shock. And then I did a study, which I think was really critical, which is I had been using it. So I was the chief of a service with 17 ICU doctors on it. I tried to convince all of them to use it as an ICU protocol, gave them all of the data. Guess what do you think happened, Ben?
0 out of 17.
No, it was a little bit better than that. It was 4.
Okay.
I literally got attacked. People thought it was the most outrageous thing, even though I was showing them paper after paper, which shows that on average, a patient admitted to an ICU has literally near undetectable vitamin C levels. It gets all consumed. So you have severe vitamin C deficiency of anyone coming into an ICU. And I was like, why can't we just call it a repletion protocol? And we'll just put them on, like, you know, like we do potassium, magnesium. Like,
Yes.
it's simple. We're just repleting vitamin C. And I got attacked. My chief came after me. He thought I was completely bonkers. But I did get about 4 of us to routinely use it. And those 4, they started to see things too that they'd never seen before. So after about a year, we did this retrospective study. And what I discovered in that research is that the life-saving benefits were very time dependent. And what we discovered is that if you got IV vitamin C within 6 hours of entering the ER or any hospital, basically nobody died. If you got it between 6 and 12 hours, there was still a large reduction in mortality. But after 12 hours, from admission to your first illness or visit to the hospital, you didn't have that mortality benefit. There were other benefits, but they weren't as profound. So it's quite a time-sensitive thing. And so I published that paper. And so I was like, I just became very close with Paul. He and I became like partners and colleagues. And then, but let me go back to your question about like, what was my, like, let's call it an awakening, right? So I've said this before, but prior to COVID, Ben, if you'll forgive me, I was a New York City liberal who voted Democrat. I read the New York Times religiously. I believed it was the arbiter of truth and the true, factual evidence of what was going on in the world. Like I had the highest esteem for New York Times. I've been raised to read it. I've been reading it since I was 6. I believed in the medical journals, particularly the high impact ones. I thought only the best science and scientists published there. I believe the public health agencies were doing the best they could. In fact, I even thought Fauci was like a sympathetic guy in a tough spot with a lot of critics. Now, how far have I come? None of those things are true anymore, right? So COVID really did awaken me, and as well as Paul. And I have to say, Paul's not here right now, but I would speak for Paul. I think he and I had very similar political sensibilities, trust in institutions, trust in the journals. And what we discovered in COVID, being on the front lines of COVID, because we were literally trying to lead, we were trying to fill in gaps where the government was failing. They were not offering any treatment recommendations. And people are dying left and right. And we thought that was absurd. The stay at home until your lips turn blue. I mean, it's such an absurdity that they would do that. And we were trying to reach out to officials and leaders, and we were trying to suggest therapies. But the problem is that gets messy, right? Everyone wants to suggest therapies. But I say that's okay. As long as they're safe and have some promise of efficacy, why not use it? Yeah. Instead, they were all doing this supportive care only. And so, but anyway, once we started to put out protocols, and then once Paul identified the signal around ivermectin, and I wrote that review paper and I gave that testimony, that's when my life really changed in terms of not only awakening, but also persecution. So as I was awakening, I was also getting persecuted. And what I came to discover, and this is a long answer to the opening question, but I discovered, because I was a world expert on a really timely and global topic, I discovered that there was nothing but lies and distortions and persecuting actions, all directed at ivermectin. I had to read the best newspapers in the world spew lies about ivermectin. I had to see PR campaigns calling it a horse dewormer, where every talking head on television is saying horse dewormer, horse dewormer, horse dewormer, like reading off of a script. I saw papers, studies getting published from the top universities in the world in the best journals that were so brazenly and clearly manipulated to show that ivermectin didn't work. And that's when that blew my head off, Ben, because I saw the top journal in the world, the New England Journal of Medicine, published a Together trial. And those of us who had studied the trial, like, we saw all of the stuff they were pulling in that trial, but to no avail. That thing sailed through peer review and was published, and then it ignited PR campaigns across the world. Latest high-quality, rigorous trial on ivermectin shows it's not effective, right? And then what the FDA did, scaring the pharmacists, you couldn't fill ivermectin. You know, I was losing jobs left and right. I couldn't remain employed. There was media hit jobs going after me. And so, like, my life went sideways real quick, because what I discovered a few months into that war is that what I was up against was a massive disinformation campaign. How I discovered that was one day, and this is kind of probably the biggest awakening that happened to me, is it was a few months after my ivermectin testimony, and this world expert in vitamin D, a guy named by Dr. William B. Grant out in California, don't know who he is, writes me an email, 2 lines in the email. He says, "Dear Dr. Kory, what they've been doing to ivermectin, they've been doing to vitamin D for decades." And he included a link to an article called the Disinformation Playbook. I'm telling you, your listeners and readers should go to that article. Just Google it, the Disinformation Playbook. It's short, it's easy to read, it's got cool graphics. And I opened this article and I'm like, whoa. And basically, the article was written in 2017, and they defined Disinformation Playbook as the tactics employed by corporations when science emerges that's inconvenient to their interests. And they have all of these case studies in there of different disinformation campaigns, conducted by corporations when science. And by the way, the first Disinformation Playbook, it was invented by the tobacco industry. When around the time when Babe Ruth got jaw cancer, like, he was their number one pitchman and spokesman, suddenly cigarettes weren't looking good. People were linking it to cancer, and they hired a PR firm to do, and that's literally, these campaigns are run by PR firms. And I read that article, it was March of 21, and like, it's like a light bulb went off in my head. I was like, that is what's going on. I didn't know what was going on, Ben. There were so many things that were happening to us that were bad. Not only the censoring, the deplatforming, the hit jobs, but like, my paper got retracted even after passing peer review. It was supposed to be published, and suddenly the publisher retracts it with a BS reason. So like, I just couldn't figure out why the world was behaving, because I literally thought we had identified and we're trying to disseminate knowledge of a really effective therapeutic. And instead, all we got was backlash from that. And I realized after reading that article that repurposed drugs that are off patent are literally the Achilles heel of the pharmaceutical industry. They will crush any drug that threatens their pricey pipeline patented pharmaceuticals. They've been doing it for decades. And like that researcher said, what they've done to vitamin D, if you look at the entire literature on vitamin D, basically it shows that it doesn't work for anything, because for every positive trial, they'll publish a negative trial. So then they leave it controversial and not adopted. So you don't have a clear signal for how important vitamin D is, because the literature is so polluted. And vitamin D is just one example, right? They do this with all sorts of other drugs. Whether they're pro, like SSRIs, they'll bury all studies of negative adverse effects. Or if it's a threatening drug like ivermectin, they put out fraudulent trials. And once I discovered like the playbook, the game, and then there's another tactic called the blitz, where they harass the scientists bringing out that inconvenient science. And once I read that, I was like, oh, that's what's going on. I'm getting blitzed.
You have a name for it.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, oh, and one of the examples was Merck, because Merck with Vioxx, they had a hit list of doctors who were trying to call out warnings on Vioxx with heart attacks. And so they were messing with those doctors who were just doing the right thing. And so like, I don't think people understand just how insidious and powerful the pharmaceutical industry is in medicine, and particularly the stuff they pulled in COVID. I mean, to me, their sum total of their actions were crimes against humanity. I mean, they caused millions of people to die around the world because of their distortion of information, censoring, publishing of false science. It transformed me as a doctor and as a man. Like, I'm not the same guy anymore. My cynicism and skepticism now knows no bounds, whereas before I think I was quite naive. I do not trust the high impact journals. I don't even read them anymore because you don't know what to trust. And that sentiment has been shared by former editors of those journals, right? You probably know about Marsha Angel. She was 20-year editor of New England Journal of Medicine. She stepped down from her post to write a book about how corrupt the journals were. And she said over half of what's printed in those journals, you have it. That's it. Yeah, I read it too. But there's other, like British Medical Journal, The Lancet, those editors have also come out and said how corrupt the journals are. And I don't know what you were like before COVID, but I trusted him. And I would chide Paul. I'd be like, Paul, did you know this stuff? Because Paul's been publishing his whole life in journals, honest science, but Paul said he had no idea it was that bad. No idea. Until you start looking at that topic, you don't know. But when did you buy that book?
That was years ago. I started waking up in 2012, and that's a
whole
story my audience knows. But after 7 years of conventional medicine, I met a doctor and it took a year for me arguing with him, but he told me there's no such thing as diseases. They're all consequences rooted in inflammation, oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction. He started connecting some dots. Again, it took a year for me to really there's no way what you're saying could be true. And he's like, oh yeah, these diseases will go into remission. Give the body what it needs, avoid what it doesn't. Basic stuff
we're not taught in medical school.
Exactly. And of course I kept going back to, there's no way, you're right. If type 2 diabetes is totally reversible, which is what he told me, then my endocrinologist professor at UT Houston and Waco Family Practice and here at Texas Tech would have told me that, would have been teaching that, be on the news, be in the journals. That cognitive dissonance. So that was in 2012 for me. So I was pretty prepared for when COVID hit.
I had COVID is what did it for me, because it wasn't just learning about the disinformation and ivermectin. I'd already started questioning a lot of the behaviors, which were so brazenly kind of idiotic and non-scientific. And I think one of my first kind of head scratching moments was, I think it was April of 2020. I remember I was driving in the car, listening to NPR, if I recall correctly. And they announced that the FDA had just restricted hydroxychloroquine to the hospital. And I'm sitting there in the car. Now, I didn't know that hydroxychloroquine worked. I wasn't on the hydroxychloroquine bandwagon. In fact, at that time, I didn't think it worked. But I said to myself, whether it works or not, if you're going to use it, you want to use it in the first hours or days of any viral syndrome. You're not going to wait 8 days until they land in the hospital. I wouldn't use hydroxychloroquine then. And I just why would they do that? I was like, that's so stupid. Yeah. I thought it was stupidity, Ben. And then probably the final nail in the coffin where I finally concluded this whole thing is captured. The agencies are captured. The journals are captured. I gave up thinking that there was and what you just described, our educational system is captured. Universities are captured. All of these things that they teach, they're all manufactured and controlled. It's what they want you to know. It's not, they don't want you to know what's real. And the final nail in the coffin was a few weeks after the vaccine campaign. And I had a couple of guys that I knew that were internists who were checking COVID antibodies before vaccinating. Reasonable, right? If they got antibodies, why would you give them an old antigen? And in response, very quickly, the FDA put a page on their website saying that there was no scientific evidence for that practice and that it should not be done. And that's when I was like, whoa, it was so brazen that what they were trying to do is make the market of arms that it can be eligible for a vaccine to be the biggest possible. I was like, it's so clear that they're doing that. They're disappearing natural immunity so that they could jab everybody.
Are you ready to take control of your health together? You're not alone. Dr. Ben, as well as a mission-driven team here at Veritas, created this online wellness membership because so many are suffering. We want to help more people by sharing the truth, that we believe will change lives. Veritas Wellness membership is more than just a wellness program. It's a movement designed to empower you with truth, practical tools, and a support community at a price that's accessible for everyone. One membership covering your entire household. Upon signing up, you gain access to life-changing educational resources, expert-led webinars, live movement classes and exercise series, community groups and wellness initiatives, interactive classes, as well as exclusive discounts on supplements and advanced lab testing. We also offer complimentary, unlimited peace consults, a space for you to go deeper, discover who you were created to be, and explore how stress contributes to disease. We believe in getting to the root cause and understanding why what we believe truly matters. Our team of wellness navigators are here to guide you every step of the way. So whether you're just starting your wellness journey or ready to go deeper, there's something here for you. So jump in today. We can't wait to walk this journey with you. Visit VeritasWellnessMember.com to get started.
And that scared me. I was like, wow, like that was the clearest evidence that our agents are completely working for pharma and the military, but that's another discussion. But yeah, so my awakening was pretty rapid, but it was complete. It was total. Like the scope and the scale of what I saw they could do in COVID was overwhelming and terrifying. It was almost like I lived in a different world, in a world that I didn't live in before. So for me, it was a really rapid and really transformative awakening.
Yeah, for sure. Could you talk a little bit for people that don't know about the experience, or maybe even with Paul Merrick's experience in the ICU treating COVID with vitamin C and ivermectin or whatever? What were you seeing and what was he seeing, and what came of that?
So I think you'll appreciate this nuance, but the first thing we did as a group, so we formed as the FLCCC in March of 2020. I think our website was up by April 1st. We put out our first protocol for hospital ICU care. It was called the Math Plus protocol. It was methylprednisolone, which was recommended against by everybody in the world, ascorbic acid, vitamin C, thiamine, and heparin. We saw these patients were clotting like crazy. And then we had other elements that we added too. But here's my experience. Paul and Joe, two of my colleagues in the FLCCC, they were having immense success. Their mortality rates were really low. In my ICU, I did not see those benefits, and there's a reason why. In both Paul and Joe's hospitals, the patients with COVID were on their service on admission. So they were starting the protocol on admission to the hospital. I was getting patients who were on the floors for 5 days, 6 days a week. They were crashing onto ventilators, then coming to me. And when I started all that stuff, I could turn a couple of people around, but it largely wasn't. It was just too late. Like, every disease, the earlier you treat, the better the outcomes. And COVID was particularly sensitive to that. And so I didn't have the same success, but we were tracking Paul and Joe's, and they were doing really well. They were turning some really sick patients around or preventing them from going to the ICU, but they had a very good ICU mortality. In fact, Paul got access to his hospital data. He had 50% less the mortality of anyone else working in his ICU. But he was the only one using the protocol. So, we know how to treat disease, and we were using steroids from the get-go. And steroids turned out to be the most controversial thing for months. Everyone, all the ID doctors said, oh, you're going to kill them. With steroids, it'll make the infection worse. And we knew it wasn't about the virus anymore. It was inflammation. And so we did really well with steroids. And ultimately, we were vanquished. I testified in the Senate about the critical need for corticosteroids in May of 2020. That was the first time that Senator Johnson invited me to speak. It didn't go viral like the ivermectin one. But Senator Johnson told me afterwards that he heard from doctors all over the country thanking Senator for giving me that platform, because after they heard me give that testimony, it emboldened a lot of doctors to start using corticosteroids, and they were seeing that it was turning people around. But I said that testimony at a time when every national and international healthcare organization said not to use steroids. But we had tons of data. We knew steroids were critical. We knew that from SARS and MERS epidemic. Doctors in China and in the Far East, they knew that corticosteroids were critical in dealing with, hospitalized, MERS and SARS patients. And so we had, it just, That's just another thing. Like everything I did in COVID completely disagreed with what they were doing. And if I may say so, Ben, we got everything right.
Yeah.
We got everything right.
Yeah. Well, even to this day, it was just maybe a month ago, which this is hearsay, but a good friend of mine told me, a local physician made fun of him when he found out he used ivermectin when my friend had COVID back in the day. And the doctor said, "Oh, the horse dewormer. What in the world were you thinking?" That was a month ago. But to just touch a little bit on ivermectin, and we don't have to go a deep dive. We do want to get into, the future of medicine and all that, but maybe just because of that comment, I'm not trying to prove anything to all these doctors. You've got to have eyes to see and ears to hear. And if people aren't seeking the truth, looking for the truth, I mean, what you're about to say about ivermectin is going to bounce off of them. But the data is just so overwhelming. But how did you first get onto it? What did you start to see? And maybe kind of a brief summary of where we at now.
Yeah, that's good. So what happened was, after we put out our hospital protocol, Paul, and we're in a nonprofit, and our whole goal was to just come up for treatment protocols, but we wanted to be scientific. So we were looking at the evidence as it was emerging for lots of different therapeutics, and Paul even started like this kind of Excel table, and he had it color coded. Like if the evidence was strong, he gave it a green light as far as use. If it was uneven, he gave it a yellow, and if it showed harm or inefficacy, he put it red. And so we had like this almost like a medication tracker, because the evidence was coming out so fast, right? You remember that? We'd look at preprints all the time. There's like studies that you're hearing of. And he had ivermectin on there through the summer with a question mark, because we'd heard that ivermectin might be helpful, but there was no data. There's no data on ivermectin. And then what happened was in September, early October of 21, the studies started popping up, and they're coming from around the world. Some were case series, some were small studies, but the benefits were massive. And when you started to put those trials together, you saw this overwhelming signal. And so Paul presented the data to us one day in October, and I was so intrigued by it that I immediately started to draft a review paper. It was called Review of the Emerging Evidence for Ivermectin in COVID-19. And I think when I started my draft, I probably had 6 trials. By the time I completed the paper, I had like 37 trials. So like writing the paper was hard, because every day that I was like finishing up my draft, the next morning I'd wake up, a new study came out on a preprint. I'm like, got to put it into the analysis. And so what I discovered in starting to learn about ivermectin, and I was shocked to learn this, but that they had been studying ivermectin as an antiviral for 10 years. 2012 was the first paper they did where they did an in vitro study on I think it might have been polio, but there was like a dozen studies showing ivermectin stopped the replication of like West Nile, dengue, polio, not measles, but Zika virus, HIV, influenza. And so there's tons of this in vitro data that it was a broad antiviral. And the Nobel Prize winner who discovered it, he knew it too. At the beginning of COVID, he had won the Nobel Prize with a scientist from Merck. He wrote to Merck early in COVID saying, please, can we have funds to do a study on ivermectin? We know it's broadly antiviral. So it had the mechanisms. The clinical data was screaming from everywhere. The first patient I treated turned around overnight. Everything that was there. We knew this thing was a COVID, really highly effective drug at treating COVID. And so we put it in our protocol. And then pretty soon after that, I went back to the Senate for my second time, and I gave the testimony. And that's just kind of how it blew up. But that's when the war started. That's when, as soon as it started getting attention, you had all these media articles saying, oh, the trials are all low quality and can't be trusted. They're all small and poorly randomized. And you just hear this evidence-based medicine speak, all these pedigree doctors just basically saying, other people are so brazen. They'd be like, oh, that's just another drug to be debunked, like hydroxychloroquine. And they would lump it in with, anyone who believed that anti-parasite thing worked is a crazy fringe quack. Later it was an anti-vaxxer. Yeah. And so they can ridicule and disparage things in these subtle and not so subtle ways. And it doesn't get credibility. Whereas you get a complete corruption like remdesivir, is lauded and infused to every hospitalized patient in this country by infectious diseases ever, because the journals tell them that it's good and it's safe. Doctors are so trusting. They're also the most propagandized in society in all of COVID, because they were key to COVID. They were getting it from 360. They were getting it from the journals, the agencies, the hospitals, and the media. And so they literally were believing everything they were being told, and all of that information was being controlled, and almost all of it was false.
Yeah. What happened, if you want to get into it, with you said your job started going away or hard to employ, and Paul, I don't remember with Paul, but
yeah,
did it get to that level?
So of the 5 of us in the FLCCC, 3 of our careers ended. The other one, his hospital got closed down. And the 5th one kind of stayed under the radar. And I think he escaped a lot of the persecution. And we were much more in public, me and Paul. But what happened with me is I resigned from the University of Wisconsin early in COVID because I refused to be a leader if they were going to do supportive care only. I was getting blowback from using corticosteroids, anticoagulants, things like that, and IV vitamin C. And I just said, I refuse. And I said, I ethically and morally object to your supportive care only. I do not want to be a part of this. And I left. I actually went back to New York and I fought on the front lines there because they were getting hammered in April of 2020. So I went back to my old ICU there. My next job was the day after my ivermectin testimony. They sent me a new contract, which had all sorts of infringements on my free speech. And I told them, they didn't fire me. And I said, oh, you're sending me a new contract? I said, I'm going to tell you right now. The meeting was that night. And I told the chief medical officer, I said, you don't have to send the contract. If you put anything in there which restricts my ability to speak publicly, I'm not signing. And 6 hours later, we're on a Zoom. They send me the contract while we're in the Zoom. I open it up. There's like 6 clauses where I have to ask permission, before talking to the press, doing anything. And I just said, I will not accept this. So that one, I kind of got forced out. And then I started to do locums work, and I was so happy. I got a gig in the center of Wisconsin. I was making the best money I've made in my career, working like a dog. But I loved it. I had a lot of freedom there, a lot of autonomy. The nurses loved me. I became really good friends with the head of ID there, and he was supportive of ivermectin. So it was great. And my partners that hired me, they were really appreciative of it. Some of them had even owned my book. I taught them ultrasound at courses in the years prior. So I was a little bit of a mini celebrity in terms of just old stuff then. Yeah. But the hospital, the CMO, kept sending hit jobs in the media to my partners, telling them to get rid of Kory. And they backed me up, and for 6 months, they told the administration, they said, if Kory goes, we go. And that place was impossible to recruit to. They had really hard times recruiting there. So my job was safe until the mandates came out. And then the hospital pulled some shenanigans, and they did what's called a sham peer review. Basically, they put some complaints into your employment record, and then they get rid of you. Yeah. In my case, since I was an independent contractor, it was a quick phone call. It was like, hey, Pierre, we don't need you anymore. In Paul's case, what they did to Paul, I think still Paul is damaged from that, because after his 30 or 40-year career, not one patient complaint, not one employee or student complaint. In a span of about 6 weeks, 8 complaints showed up in his record, all anonymous. You don't have to have names. There's no investigations. Some of them were so brazenly made up. And then he had to go before the credentials committee. And the committee voted to remove his credentials. So they literally ended his career. Have you heard of sham peer review before, Ben? That was something Paul and I learned about when it happened.
No, I haven't.
So sham peer review is actually, it's almost like the Misinformation Playbook. It's a playbook for how hospitals get rid of doctors causing problems. And I'm not talking about problems like, abusing, harassing anyone, just like someone who's not towing the line that they don't want on staff. That's what they do. They do sham peer reviews. And so they did a sham peer review on Paul, and his clinical career ended. It ended. He had no more privileges. And then Umberto Maduri, who's another member, he's literally the world expert of corticosteroids and critical illness, immensely well published, brilliant guy, they ended his career. He worked for the VA, and we happen to know this specifically, but the call came in from Washington. He worked in Memphis, to the Memphis VA, and they said, get rid of Maduri. And they basically, his boss forced him to retire. They threatened his pension if he didn't retire.
Unbelievable. I mean, it is believable, actually, but.
Well, that's the blitz.
So, I mean, you have the most published Paul Merrick in the whole field, the world's authority on corticosteroids, just boom. That can be a little disheartening or a lot disheartening for the general public that's listening, other physicians that are listening. We've got about 15 minutes left. What's the future look like? And is there hope? And how do we turn this thing around?
Well, you know, before, Ben, you were talking about, like, you don't know what the future looks like, whether we're going to build a different system, a parallel, or inside. I don't know. I mean, obviously I don't tell the future, but where I live in the world right now, like, I live in a completely different sort of, I guess, network world than I did. Like, I'm out of that system, Ben. You know, after I lost my third job, I went into private practice. I don't talk with a lot of my former trainees or colleagues much. A couple of them call, and there's been a couple of supporters. Most of them went quiet. I think they thought I lost my mind. And obviously they're getting propagandized like crazy. So they probably said, oh, Kory lost his mind. He doesn't know what he's talking about anymore, which is really odd because I'd won awards throughout my career. They knew I was a really good doctor. I had taught all of them medicine. And so, you know, to get written off so quickly is a bit odd, but, you know, you can be made to believe anything, as I've learned. But, you know, I see the solution. I don't know how to fix that system. I know how to, I think, make, like, if you look at what Bobby's doing, he's making small, I think, important changes. I think the more of that it's just going to get, that system is going to get better, and it's going to be more true towards its aim. But I think fundamentally it will always be captured and corrupt. But I do think you can make improvements there. But for real medicine and a medicine that people want to go to, I really think the answer is private practice. I mean, since I left the system, and I have to, by the way, I don't take insurance. I can't. First of all, they took away my boards. I think you know that, right? I was boarded in 3 specialties, and they took away my board certifications. And so no insurance company would have me anyway. So I just charge fees. But what I like about that is it's just so cool, man. Practicing medicine. I don't have an employer. I don't have an insurance company. It's literally me and my patient, and they pay fees. I can do, when I say I can do whatever I want, obviously I'm using a lot of judgment, prudence, deep study, but I'm learning a world of medicine that I never would have accessed before. I mean, I probably use 10 therapies that if you'd asked me about them 5 years ago, I'd be like, that's a bunch of crap. I mean, methylene blue, hyperbaric oxygen, chlorine dioxide, you know, like all of these things that I use like with alarming regularity and that are really effective. I would have laughed at years ago. And so I'm having more fun. I'm more inspired, and my patients love it. The problem with my practice, and I don't want to sound like falsely modest, but like most of my career, I took care of poor people, you know, like especially in New York City. Most of my career was in New York City. I mean, I worked at hospitals where it's like 40 to 50% Medicaid patients. And like now we're delivering excellent care. My patients in my practice are so happy, but they also have money. You know, so like it's hard. It's, you know, it's a shame that system already is having some disparities, right? Like it's not built for poor people, and you can't deliver high quality care for no money. You know, you have to get reimbursed for good quality care, and so we got the good quality care part, but the costs are still higher than it can for most people. But I see that a lot of growth in that, and especially the need for autonomy. The way they went after doctors who prescribe, you know, people who lost their licenses for doing off-label prescribing of ivermectin, which is a standard practice, has been for 30 years. You can prescribe any drug for any indication you want as long as it has FDA approval. 30% of prescriptions are off-label. But suddenly you lost your livelihood if you used one of the safest medicines in history. So the system is so scary that, like, you know, Ben, I was talking to you before we got on about, I wrote a post this weekend about, I presented all the data of how badly quality of care is declining in the US right now. And I came up with like a whole bunch of drivers for it. And, one of them is like that persecution of doctors, and they're protocolizing everything. And so you can't like when I was practicing in the ICU, man, if I had someone crashing and I wanted to try something, even something like methylene blue, I did that in emergencies because you can do that for like severe vasoplegic shock. But like I would think up stuff, I would try different things, and like if I heard something at work, I could do it. And what I'm hearing now is like it's much more rigid and controlled. Like pharmacy won't fill something for you unless you have a randomized controlled trial to show them. So it's like getting policed to where there's no autonomy or freedom. That's hurting patients. The other thing is another reason why I think quality of care, but this is a more touchy topic. I think there's a lot of cognitively impaired physicians because they were the most highly vaccinated subpopulation in the country. And neurological injury and cognitive deficits are immensely common after vaccination. Also, I found data, which is the scariest data, Ben, but the NPs are proliferating like mad. And I want to be careful about that because my practice, my partner's an NP, the ones that work for me are NPs, they are phenomenal, but they don't make them like they used to. My NPs have extensive nursing experience and extensive NP experience. Now, young nurses are going to nursing school. They might do a half a year on the floors, and then they go become an NP. And so you're getting these very poorly experienced NPs that are proliferating. And it's the fastest growing occupation in America. And then when you look at PAs, they're like the second or third fastest growing occupation. And if you see the numbers, there's an attrition of doctors, but there's an explosion in NPs. And my worry is the old guard, the wise older, teachers of the art of medicine, if they're, there's attrition there and you're just filling it up with like relatively inexperienced and not extensively trained clinicians, that does not a good recipe for excellent medical care. And the burnout rates that I discovered, like the burnout rates in medicine went from 38% to like 68% in COVID. Now there's a lot of reasons to get burnt out of COVID, but like, I think they're stressed, they're controlled. I think they're leaving, they're getting sick, meaning that, the older, wiser doctors, and there's just nothing but like young guns who I don't think have sufficient training. I think they can gain the experience over years, but at those numbers and at that rate, and I think the teaching and clinical experiences are getting diluted. I think doctors are probably seeing less patients because there's so many NPs. And so I think it's almost like a vicious cycle, but I see that going really badly. Now, the one good part, like one of the good things, and this is what I'm working on with my new nonprofit, is with Bobby in there. I know him personally, and he has told me he's really interested in removing restrictions and funding research into off-patent therapies or ones that they restrict to. Like he has psilocybin on his list. But like chlorine dioxide, DMSO, I mean, there's so many therapies that are ignored and or suppressed that really deserve good, honest science behind them because they're cheap, safe, widely available, and highly effective. Particularly DMSO in strokes and brain bleeds, it can be a transformative therapy. And they stopped using it years ago because the FDA did some dumb stuff around it. And so I do think that is one. Like, I'm really interested to see what Bobby's tenure brings about. I mean, I know he's getting crap, right? Anything he does, you get the media screaming at him over everything, telling lies. But he's a very deeply studied man, very knowledgeable, and I think he has a pretty clear idea on how to fix some of this stuff. And with Macri and Bhattacharya, they're already sounding – I haven't heard public health officials make sense in 5 years, right? Suddenly, you're hearing guys behind those podiums, they talk, and I'm like, hey, that sounds good. That sounds right. Like, it's so encouraging finally, isn't it?
Yes, it is. A breath of fresh air for sure.
It really is. Yeah.
Well, I think a big part of the solution is in doing what you're doing. Obviously, get upstream, get people before the hospital, teach them how to not need that system. I mean, the body will function so amazingly if you give it what it needs, avoid what it doesn't. That doctor that first got my attention years ago, And just for the audience out there, I don't want y'all to be panicking about how that system's just failing, basically. We're I think, watching it implode on itself. And what Dr. Kory just said about these doctors leaving and an inexperienced nurse practice coming in, the future may be a little worrisome there. Well, just the number one way to not worry about that system is to not need it.
That's what I was about to say, but I knew you were going to say that, but I like that you said, I don't want to frighten or terrorize people by painting this really dark picture, but I would like to say just what you said is maybe hear that message as a motivation to keep yourself healthy. Just use it as a motivation to keep yourself healthy, keep yourself out of the hospital.
Yeah. And I always like to take every opportunity I can to remind the listeners that all that high infant mortality rate in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we see a 98 to 99% drop in that mortality from all these big scary germs prior to vaccines rolling out. And that should be a huge alarm going off. Whoa, how did they do that? What happened? And it was clear. The terrain got cleaned up, and a lot of that was external terrain, better sanitation, refrigeration, nutrition, etc. And now it's internal terrain. It's our cells are so full of toxicity, meaning oxidative stress, because we're not stewarding that carburetor, that mitochondria. And that's it. It's that simple.
I agree.
It is a matter of just giving the body what it needs. It's a diet and lifestyle, including our thinking, and fear absolutely shuts down that mitochondria, drives oxidative stress, which could sound crazy to people, but it's true. And so it is the basics. The body's amazingly designed. Get back to those basics, and then you don't need to fret over measles, germs, or genes or anything else.
Good message. Love it.
It takes knowledge, and it takes us realizing the truth and what has been very well laid out here in the last hour.
Yep.
The love of money, I think, is at the very root of it. And we see this captured everything. Yep. Education's captured, the system, all the institutions. It's just a capturing. So just divorce yourself from that system. Don't need that system, and then walk in peace and truth and joy and live your long life that God intended for you to live, and it'll be fine.
Yeah, I always say my main rule in life is seek out information from those without a conflict of interest. Very hard to do, but there are people without conflicts of interest, and you want a true, unbiased, transparent source. And unfortunately, you're not going to find that in the media or the government. But luckily, we have the internet. I actually think what's saving the world is the internet, because it just has an amazing, but even though they try to control and shut it down and platform and delist and censor, it's too big, too vast, and too uncontrollable. And so if you're smart and use judgment, because actually, to be honest, Ben, I think what happened in COVID, it was a war of information. Yeah. And the information was so polluted, and it was all propaganda. And I'll just, the best definition of propaganda is that it's a story or a message to get you to think or act in a certain way. And I saw propaganda getting people to think really strange things and do really when I say strange, things that were clearly bad for their health and led to worse outcomes, but it all came from the information sphere. And so I think part of health, part of detoxifying our world is not only keeping free of the poisons in our food, our water, our air, but you need clean, good information in order to stay healthy. And I think that's why you have a podcast, Ben.
That's why I bring on amazing guests like you.
That was my plug for you, man.
Thank you. I need all the help I can get. But let's plug you a little bit, because that Substack, which I've not read, but I'm going to.
Yeah.
Talk to the audience about how people can follow you.
Yes, I write a lot on health topics, mostly on promising therapies that I research and learn about and use. And people really seem to like it. But it's called Pierre Kory medicalmusings.com. So Pierre Kory medicalmusings.com. But yeah, that's my Substack. And then my book is The War on Ivermectin. And then my nonprofit is Rebuild Medicine.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Dr. Pierre Kory, thank you for.
My practice too. I do telehealth in all 50 states. We do vaccine injury, long COVID. We do repurposed cancer protocols. And that's the Leading Edge Clinic.
.com.
It's drpierrekory.com, but if you just Google Leading Edge Clinic, we actually show up on a Google search.
Awesome. You're going to continue to do amazing stuff, and thank you for sharing your story with this. I think it's going to encourage a lot of people to get motivated to go be healthy.
Yeah. And thanks for your work, Ben, with everything you're doing down there in Texas, especially with this measles nonsense. And I know you're keeping the kids safe, and I'm glad you're doing it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your help and your support.
Absolutely.
All right, everybody. Dr. Pierre Kory, I'll check out all his different things, and we will be back next week with another great show. Remember, you're the cure. This will be on all the podcasts and on the website, veritaswellnessmember.com. We'll see y'all next week. Bye-bye.